Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a Screencast-O-Matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at executive privilege. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson and to scroll down the correct section. Please keep in mind here that the first part of the presentation deals with the first two general questions about executive privilege, and then the second half deals with specific examples of executive privilege by previous presidents. So let's go ahead and get started, and remember that you can play any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. President Trump invoked executive privilege. Here's the history of that presidential power. So here's an introduction. When Congress issues a subpoena for documents, usually they get what they want, but that's not the case for certain documents related to the 2020 census question about citizenship. The Department of Justice said on Wednesday in a letter to Elijah E. Cummings, chairman of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, the reason President Trump is invoking executive privilege. The committee voted to recommend holding Attorney General William P. Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with the subpoenas. Though the committee's Republicans say that the administration has already provided thousands of pages of relevant documents, but Trump is unlikely to face consequences for failing to comply. That's because the doctrine of executive privilege, which Trump invoked for the first time in his presidency just a month ago, to block the House Judiciary Committee Democrats from seeing special counsel Robert Mueller's unredacted report, gives presidents wide leeway to keep secrets. So what is executive privilege? Time once summed up the evolution of the concept as George Washington invoked it, Dwight Eisenhower named it, and Richard Nixon abused it. Here's what to know about the term and how it's used and evolved over time. What is executive privilege? One off-cited definition comes from Mark Rosell, author of 2 books on executive privilege and the founding dean of SAR School of Policy and Government of George Mason University. He defined executive privilege in a 1998 Minnesota Law Review article as the right of the president and high-level executive branch officers to withhold information from Congress, the courts, and ultimately the public when it comes to 1. Certain national security needs, and 2. Protecting the privacy of White House deliberations when it is the public interest to do so. So the term executive privilege is not in the U.S. Constitution, but it's considered an implied power based on the separation of powers, laid out in Article 2, which is meant to make sure that one branch of government doesn't become all-powerful. Executive privilege is one way the legislative branch's power over the executive is limited. For example, when Congress investigated George W. Bush's firing of 8 U.S. attorneys in 2006, the White House counsel at the time, Fred Fleming, alluded to the executive privilege in a letter referencing the constitutional prerogatives of the presidency. But prominent constitutional law expert Raul Berger famously called it a constitutional myth in his 1974 book literally entitled Executive Privilege, A Constitutional Myth. So then, why do presidents need executive privilege? Well, the basic idea behind executive privilege is that an entity like the US government requires a lot of transparency, but also can't function if there's no possible way to speak about things confidentially. All reasonably complicated organizations need some space in which people can discuss what they're going to do, and with some degree of confidentiality. Why? If you know everything you consider is going to be made public or shared in some way, then that's all going to chill your ability to have frank and open discussion, says Michael Dorf, a constitutional law expert at Cornell Law School. The early understanding is simply that this is just a logical consequence of separation of powers, that each branch has to be able to assert its powers relative to the other branches. Generally, presidents will invoke executive privilege in matters relating to national security, the military, and foreign affairs, for example, to protect the names of spies and informants. So this content here essentially answers the first 2 questions, and now we're going to jump to the next part of the reading on when presidents have specifically used executive privilege. So let's go ahead and get started with the next part here. One of the great constitutional myths is the principle of executive privilege. Though the term is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, every president has called upon it when necessary. As George Mason University professor Mark Rosell explained in a 1999 article for the Minnesota Law Review, executive privilege is the right of the president and high-level executive branch officers to withhold information from Congress, the courts, and ultimately the public. This power can be used in 2 circumstances like we explained before: certain national security needs and protecting the privacy of White House deliberations when it is in the public's best interest to do so. The second part is especially valuable, as it allows presidential advisors to freely speak their minds without the threat of subpoena. Every president to date has used this power in one way or another, although some have used it more famously than others. Here are some of the biggest examples. George Washington. As with so much of his presidency, George Washington set the precedent for executive privilege. After a failed military operation against Native Americans, Congress wanted to know what happened. It sought records and testimony from White House officials. Washington and his cabinet agreed that a president had a right to refuse of these requests in the name of national security. So Washington also later argued that the House of Representatives had no right to see that the Jay Treaty signed between the U.S. and Great Britain. Eventually, he relented in both of those cases, but the precedent of asserting such authority was set. And next is Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the first president to coin the term executive privilege during Senator Joseph McCarthy's crusade against communism. The president prevented cabinet members and other advisors from being questioned in the famous McCarthy Army hearings. He said, "Any man who testifies as to the advice he can give won't be working for me that night." That was designed to protect sensitive documents from coming into public view, especially the view of Senator McCarthy, and to continue the tradition of allowing advisors to speak freely without the threat of a subpoena. Some, including President Lyndon B. Johnson, believed that Eisenhower went too far with executive privilege. It was recorded that the privilege was used 44 times, sometimes by other members of the executive branch, to not even talk about the daily routines without Eisenhower's approval. So Johnson made a point to say that if his administration were to use executive privilege, he would be the sole one to invoke it, much like his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. Both presidents used it sparingly, though. Next is Richard Nixon. While the previous two presidents helped to define executive privilege, President Nixon was the one who really brought it to the forefront of American politics. Executive privilege had always been nominally used in defense of the public's interests, but Nixon attempted to use it to protect himself and other advisors during the Watergate investigation. In the landmark Supreme Court case U.S. v. Nixon, the Supreme Court unanimously declared that the executive privilege is constitutional and sometimes necessary for national security. But the court also held that, with its all non-encompassing, if requested documents and testimonies are a key part of an investigation, they must be brought forward. Therefore, the Watergate tapes were turned over to the special prosecutor. Shortly after this decision, Nixon resigned. Nixon forever changed how Americans view executive privilege. His use of the power led many Americans to believe that all uses are for the same undisclosed reasons. This may have led to Presidents Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush to use the privilege sparingly, especially Ford, who had to deal with many congressmen using the Nixon saga as leverage to make the White House as transparent as possible. Reagan was so cautious that he did not use the privilege during the investigation of the Iran-Contra affair. There would not be another controversy regarding executive privilege until 1998. And that brings us to Bill Clinton. The Clinton White House was mired in two major scandals involving Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky. During these investigations, President Clinton used executive privilege 14 times, which included protecting First Lady Hillary Clinton from testifying during the Whitewater hearings and protecting himself from testifying in both cases. His executive privilege claims, as well as his attorney-client claims in the Lewinsky investigation, were challenged in the federal court. Citing U.S. v. Nixon, the courts determined that the prosecutor's needs outweighed the confidentiality of executive documents and discussions. This ruling was not appealed to the Supreme Court as the White House sought to avoid a headline-grabbing legal loss. Clinton was eventually impeached by the White House but not convicted by the Senate, allowing him to finish his second term fully. And then down here is Barack Obama. President Obama's most famous use of executive privilege came during the Fast and Furious scandal. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had run an operation to sell guns to Mexico, in the hopes that they could track those weapons to major drug cartels and apprehend some of their members. The guns were unable to be tracked, and one was eventually used in the killing of a Border Patrol agent. Representative Darrell Issa and Senator Chuck Grassley held hearings to determine what went wrong during the mission. Obama and the Attorney General Eric Holder both said that they did not know about it until a few weeks prior to the killing and did not authorize it. Congress and the Department of Justice ended up in a standoff over the sharing of 1,300 documents, leading Obama to assert executive privilege in order to keep them private. In retaliation, Congress voted to cite Holder for contempt of Congress. Much like Nixon and Clinton, Obama's claim of executive privilege was rejected by a federal court, and the documents were turned over. Clearly, in the last half-century, executive privilege has lost some of its luster, but with executive privilege maybe on the ropes after several defeats in the court over the years, history indicates that President Donald J. Trump and future presidents will continue to call upon this power, and the courts will continue to judge its necessity. So as you guys can see, that is exactly why executive privilege is controversial but yet consequential in the office of the presidency and the executive branch. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.